The morning sun fell gently over the quiet film set, painting everything in gold. Cameras were being adjusted, lights tested, and everyone moved with a kind of focused silence that only happens before something big begins. The new film was special, a project the entire industry was watching closely. But the real excitement wasn't about the script or the director. It was about who was walking onto the set that morning. Keanu Reeves arrived first. Calm as always, dressed simply, he greeted the crew one by one. He didn't rush. He never did. Every handshake felt real, every smile warm. His reputation for humility wasn't a story people told for effect. It was true. Behind that calm expression was a man who had seen pain, who had faced loss, but who still chose kindness every single time. A few minutes later, a soft sound spread across the set, heels on concrete, slow and steady, heads turned. Sandra Bullock had arrived. She looked radiant, not because of makeup or style, but because there was something quietly graceful about her. She waved to the team, thanked the makeup artist, and walked toward the main stage where Keanu stood. It was the first time they had met on a film set in years. The air shifted slightly. The crew felt it. Some of them weren't even born when these two first worked together, but even they sensed the weight of the moment. Two legends, two friends, two souls who had once shared laughter that filled the world, now standing face to face again after what felt like a lifetime. Keanu smiled first. "Hey stranger," he said softly. His tone was playful, but respectful. It wasn't just a greeting. It carried years of history. Sandra smiled back, but her voice trembled slightly when she replied, "You haven't changed at all." It was half true. His kindness hadn't changed, but his eyes held stories she couldn't yet read. The director, noticing the quiet tension, gave them a moment before calling for rehearsal. Sandra and Keanu stood side by side, reading lines, and though they were professionals, there was a faint awkwardness in the air, the kind that happens when something real tries to find its balance again. Between takes, Keanu made small jokes, nothing loud or forced, just gentle humor that slowly melted the invisible wall between them. He talked about how strange it felt to see the same faces of the crew looking half their age, and Sandra laughed softly, remembering their first big hit together. She remembered how he had always been patient, how he had defended her when she doubted herself, how he had stood by her during long nights of exhaustion and pressure. The first day was filled with practice scenes, but the energy wasn't perfect. Sandra felt nervous, even though she'd acted all her life. Something about this reunion carried emotion she hadn't prepared for. During lunch, she sat quietly near a window, watching the light change, when Keanu walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I remember you used to take it with just a hint of sugar," he said as he placed 1 cup beside her. Sandra looked up, surprised. "You remember that?" she asked. He nodded. "Some things stay." She took a sip, smiling, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. "You still notice the little things, don't you?" she said. "That's how I survive," he answered, with a small grin that felt both wise and sad. They sat there for a moment, quiet. The noise of the crew faded into the background. It was just 2 people sharing a coffee, remembering how it felt to be young and brave, before time added layers of life they never expected. As the day went on, the atmosphere lightened. The next scene they filmed was a playful one, a short dialogue full of teasing and friendly banter. Something about it felt natural, almost too natural. The director called for a short break, but Keanu and Sandra kept going, improvising lines, laughing at each other's unexpected reactions. The crew stopped working for a second. There it was, that sound, Sandra's laughter, bright, genuine, and completely unguarded. It filled the studio like sunlight through glass. Keanu laughed too, softly but fully, and the sound of their joy blended into something everyone could feel in their chest. It wasn't acting. It was real. That the camera operators exchanged looks, and one whispered, "This is why people love them." Another nodded, smiling. "They don't fake kindness. It just lives in them." But beneath that laughter was something unspoken. Sandra felt it, the pull of memories she had buried for years. The first time Keanu had made her laugh during a long shoot, the way he had stood by her when critics had doubted her talent, and the way she had once walked away from their friendship without saying everything she wanted to say. Later that evening, when the lights dimmed and the crew started packing, Sandra stood near the exit, watching Keanu talk with the young assistant. He was patient, listening carefully to every word the assistant said, giving advice like an old friend instead of a celebrity. It reminded her of how consistent he had always been. Fame hadn't changed him. Time hadn't hardened him. As she left the set, a quiet thought crossed her mind. Maybe this project wasn't just a film. Maybe it was a chance to say the things life had interrupted. The next morning, Sandra arrived early. She found Keanu already there, reading the day's script alone under a soft light. When he noticed her, he smiled. That same warm, unhurried smile that made everyone feel safe. Couldn't sleep either. She asked gently. Not really, he said. It feels like the first film all over again. She nodded. Yeah, except this time, we know what matters. For a moment, there was silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was calm, like the pause between two notes in a song that's about to rise. The crew started arriving, and the set came alive again. Today's scenes were emotional, built on themes of forgiveness and second chances. The script demanded vulnerability, but what they brought to it went beyond words. Keanu's voice carried depth that made the room still. Sandra's eyes held emotions that didn't need acting. When the director yelled "cut," everyone remained quiet for a few seconds, as if they didn't want the spell to break. Then, applause filled the air. The assistant wiped a tear, and the director whispered, "That's the magic of truth." As Sandra walked off the stage, Keanu caught her glance and smiled softly. "See," he said, "you still make people feel." She laughed gently. "We both do." The day ended, but something new had begun. Not a romance, not nostalgia, but a reconnection built on respect, kindness, and shared understanding of how far they had come. As the lights dimmed and the crew packed up, one of the young sound operators turned to another and said quietly, "They laughed like the old days." The other replied, "Yeah," and it felt like the world stopped for a second, and maybe it did. That night, Sandra sat in her hotel room, thinking about the laughter that returned to her without warning. She realized how simple it was to laugh, to forgive, to remember the good. She wrote a small note in her diary before sleeping. It said, "Sometimes, the past returns not to haunt you, but to heal you." Keanu, sitting miles away in his quiet apartment, looked out the window at the city lights and smiled to himself. He knew tomorrow would bring more scenes, more laughter, maybe even tears. But he also knew something deeper, that kindness never grows old. It only waits for the right moment to be seen again. And tomorrow, that moment would come. The next morning began with a strange calm on the set. The crew moved quietly, setting up lights and props, yet there was an unusual stillness in the air. Everyone could feel something brewing, something different from the normal rhythm of filmmaking. The laughter and connection between Keanu and Sandra yesterday had changed the atmosphere. The team wasn't just watching two actors anymore. They were watching a story come alive before their eyes. Sandra arrived early again, this time carrying her own cup of coffee. She had barely slept. Her mind replayed the laughter from yesterday over and over. It wasn't the sound that haunted her, it was the feeling behind it. For years, she had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without worry, to trust that moment would stay kind. But Keanu had reminded her, and now she wanted to protect that feeling. She walked across the lot and saw him near the soundstage, sitting on a wooden crate, quietly feeding a stray cat that had wandered onto the set. She stopped and smiled at the sight. He had always been that way, gentle, even when no one was watching. "You still find friends everywhere," she said softly, walking closer. Keanu turned his head, smiling. "She just wanted breakfast. I couldn't say no." "You never could," Sandra replied, sitting beside him. They sat there for a few minutes, neither rushing to speak. The cat purred between them, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had forgotten to move. Then Keanu spoke quietly, almost like he was thinking aloud. "Do you ever feel like we're all just visitors in each other's stories?" Sandra looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but some visitors never really leave." Keanu nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, some stay, even when you don't see them." Their conversation was interrupted by the director's assistant, calling everyone to gather for a new sequence. Today's scene was emotional, a confrontation between two characters who had lost touch and finally met again. The script was heavy, filled with regret and silence. Sandra read her lines, feeling an unexpected connection to them. It wasn't just acting anymore. It felt personal. That as the cameras rolled, she looked at Keanu across the set. The line came out of her like a whisper. "Why didn't you say anything when I walked away?" Keanu's reply wasn't part of the script. He was supposed to say something different, But instead, he paused, looked straight into her eyes, and said softly, "Because sometimes, caring means letting someone go." The entire set went quiet. Even the director froze, unsure whether to stop or keep rolling. Sandra blinked, her throat tightening. Her next line came naturally, almost trembling. "And what if that someone wanted you to stop her?" Keanu's gaze didn't break. His voice was steady, gentle, filled with something deeper than performance. "Then I would have stayed. Every single time." The silence that followed was so real it felt alive. When the director finally said, "Cut," no one moved. A few crew members looked down, pretending to adjust things just to hide the emotion in their eyes. Sandra took a deep breath. She hadn't expected that. The scene had blurred the line between acting and truth. Something in Keanu's tone had touched an old corner of her heart. After a few moments, the director walked over, smiling gently. "That was perfect," he said quietly. "Whatever that was, keep it." Keanu nodded humbly. Sandra looked at him, trying to read his face, but all she saw was kindness, the same calm kindness that made him impossible to misunderstand. During the break, she sat outside, staring at her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from realization. She had carried old emotions for so long: guilt, distance, unspoken gratitude. Maybe this film was giving her a chance to release them all. Keanu joined her again, this time holding 2 water bottles. "You were great," he said simply. She smiled faintly. "You broke the script." "Did I?" he replied, pretending to think. Maybe the script was too small for the truth. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You always do that. Make something sound wiser than it is. Or maybe you just needed to hear it that way," he said. She fell quiet again, her heart full but calm. "Keanu," she said after a pause, "do you ever regret anything?" He thought for a moment, then answered slowly, "Only when I stopped learning from it." His words stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. As the hours passed, the scenes continued, but everyone noticed how natural their rhythm had become. Their timing, their reactions, even their silences matched perfectly. It was as if they were guided by something beyond practice. The crew whispered quietly among themselves, saying they had never seen such chemistry built on pure respect. In one quiet moment between scenes, Sandra noticed an old photo taped to the makeup mirror, a picture from their first film decades ago. Both of them were laughing, sitting on the floor, surrounded by cables and lights. She smiled at the memory, remembering how young they were, how unafraid of life everything felt back then. She called Keanu over and showed him the photo. He chuckled softly. "Look at us," he said. "We thought we knew everything, and we actually knew nothing," she replied, laughing to Dot. Then he said something that made her heart warm. "But we knew how to be kind." That was enough. For a second, she didn't answer. She just looked at him, realizing how much truth those words carried. Fame, success, awards, none of it had outlasted kindness. That was what remained. As evening approached, the crew began setting up for one last sequence, a sunset scene by the water. It was simple, but emotional. They were supposed to sit quietly, looking at the fading light, their characters finally at peace. Dot. The camera rolled. Keanu sat beside her on the wooden dock, the sun melting into the horizon. The light reflected in his calm eyes. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace. Sandra looked at him and whispered, "It's beautiful." "It always was," he said softly. "We just forget to look." The crew watched in silence. No one wanted to interrupt. The scene felt so genuine that it blurred the line between fiction and reality once again. When the director finally called cut, a few people clapped quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. As the set emptied, Keanu and Sandra stayed behind for a moment, watching the water shimmer under the fading light. Sandra finally spoke. "You know, I used to think we lost time, but now I see we were just waiting for the right moment." Keanu nodded, his voice calm. "The right moments always find their way back." She smiled softly, her eyes glistening in the last light of day. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her gently. "For what?" "For not changing," she whispered. He smiled back. "Maybe I just kept the good parts you helped me find." As they walked back to the studio, the crew from a distance watched them, still talking, still laughing softly, their silhouettes outlined by the evening glow. Someone whispered, "They're not acting anymore." The laughter that echoed that night wasn't planned. It was human, healing, and unforgettable. The morning began with a quiet mist over the city. The studio lights glowed softly through the fog as the crew prepared for another day. Everything felt peaceful, yet there was a subtle tension in the air, the kind that comes before something meaningful happens. Sandra arrived early again. She carried her script close to her chest, but her mind wasn't on the words. Last night's conversation with Keanu had stayed with her. She had gone to bed thinking about how easy it was to talk to him, how calm his presence felt, and how deeply his words echoed in her heart. When she entered the set, she saw Keanu already there, sitting on the stage floor, tying his boots. He looked up and smiled. "You're early," he said softly. She smiled back. "So are you." "Couldn't sleep much," he replied. "Too many thoughts." "About the film?" She asked. "About life," he said quietly. They both laughed gently, as if understanding that those two things were often the same. The first scene of the day was supposed to be light-hearted, a flashback in the story, where both characters remember a happier time. It required laughter, warmth, and effortless chemistry. The director, watching them rehearse, realized something special. There was no need to force anything. Their laughter came naturally, like two people who shared a language only they could understand. That as the cameras rolled, Sandra began telling a funny story that wasn't even in the script, something that had actually happened during one of their old shoots. She said, "Remember when the camera broke, and you tried to fix it with duct tape?" Keanu burst out laughing, shaking his head. "I was trying to help. You made it worse," she said, laughing even harder. The crew joined in, unable to stop smiling. The director didn't yell cut. He let the camera roll, capturing the raw, joyful energy between them. When Sandra finally caught her breath, she noticed something in Keanu's expression, a mix of amusement and nostalgia. He wasn't just laughing at the memory, he was living it again. After the scene ended, the director walked up with tears in his eyes and said quietly, "That's the heart of the movie. Whatever that was, keep it alive." During the short break, Sandra walked outside to breathe some fresh air. She stood near the garden, where a few flowers had started blooming despite the cold weather. She thought about how simple moments like this used to make her happy. Fame had stolen that simplicity for a while, but now it was returning in the form of laughter and old memories. Keanu joined her a few minutes later, holding 2 paper cups of tea this time. "I figured we needed a change from coffee," he said, handing her one. She smiled. "You always remember what people need before they do." "Maybe that's just what listening does," he replied. They stood in silence for a few moments. The wind moved softly around them, carrying the faint scent of paint, wood, and blooming flowers. Then Sandra said something she had never said before. "You know, I left so suddenly after our last project. I never said goodbye properly." Keanu looked at her gently. "You didn't need to." She frowned slightly. "I think I did." He shook his head. "Some friendships don't need goodbyes. They just paused until they're meant to return." Sandra looked down, holding her cup tightly. Her eyes softened. "I miss this," she whispered. "Me too," Keanu said quietly. Just then, the director's assistant called for them again. The next scene was emotional, one that mirrored what they had just felt. Their characters had to face their past and find peace in it. As they began filming, something unexpected happened. During one of Sandra's emotional lines, her voice cracked slightly. It wasn't scripted, but it was real. She tried to hold back tears, but her eyes filled anyway. Instead of pausing, Keanu reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Gently, silently. The director didn't stop the camera. He knew magic when he saw it. Sandra took a deep breath and finished her line, her voice trembling but honest. When the scene ended, there was a long pause before anyone moved. One of the sound operators whispered, "That didn't feel like acting." Keanu looked at her quietly, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, blinking away tears. "I'm fine. It just felt too real." He gave a small, knowing smile. "Maybe that's the point." They took a short break after that. Sandra went to the dressing area and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw someone older, wiser, but still carrying the same spark she once had. And she realized something. She had never truly lost herself. She had just forgotten who helped her believe in herself in the first place. That evening, after the day's work ended, the crew gathered around the main set for a small celebration. It was the assistant's birthday, and everyone brought simple snacks and laughter. Keanu and Sandra sat together, quietly enjoying the atmosphere. Someone asked them to share a funny story from their early days. Sandra laughed, saying, "Oh, he once forgot his line, and instead of improvising, he just stared at me like he was trying to read my mind." Keanu shook his head, laughing. I thought you'd save me. You froze too, she replied, laughing even harder. Everyone joined in. Their laughter filled the studio, echoing off the walls like a song from another time. Even the youngest crew members felt it. That rare, pure energy of kindness and shared joy. After most people left, Sandra stayed behind to help clean up. Keanu was still there, quietly folding a few chairs. She looked at him, smiling softly. You never let anyone else do the heavy lifting, do you? He smiled back. Maybe I just like finishing what I start. They walked toward the exit together. The night was cool and quiet. Sandra looked at the empty street ahead and said, You know, I think people forget that laughter can heal almost anything. Keanu nodded slowly, and kindness keeps it alive. They stood there for a few seconds, looking up at the night sky. There was peace in the silence between them, not the kind that ends things, but the kind that promises more to come. As they left, one of the lighting crew watched from a distance and said softly, They're like light and calm walking together. And maybe that was true, because even without the cameras, their connection had turned into something greater than performance. It had become a reminder that the most unforgettable scenes are the ones made of real hearts, not scripts. And as they walked away, the faint sound of their laughter drifted through the quiet night again, a laughter that carried memories, forgiveness, and hope. The fourth day of shooting began before sunrise. The studio lights flickered on one by one as the quiet rhythm of the crew filled the air. Everyone had started noticing something different about the atmosphere since Keanu and Sandra's reunion. It wasn't just another production anymore. It felt alive, like the set itself breathed with emotion. Sandra arrived, wrapped in a soft gray coat, holding her script close. She had slept little again, her mind replaying the past 3 days. Every moment with Keanu felt heavier now, not in a painful way, but in the kind of way that made her realize how much human connection could change everything. His calm voice, his gentle humor, his ability to listen without judgment. They had reignited something she thought time had buried. As she stepped inside, she saw him standing near the main stage, adjusting one of the props himself. A young crew member tried to stop him, saying, Sir, you don't need to do that. But Keanu smiled and replied softly, We're all part of the same team. Sandra stood there quietly, watching. Even after all these years, he was the same, grounded, respectful, humble. That was what she admired most about him. He didn't lead with fame, he led with kindness. When he noticed her, his face lit up with that familiar, gentle smile. Morning, he said calmly. She smiled back. You fixing props now? They were a little wobbly, he said, pretending to look serious. Can't risk a dramatic collapse mid-scene. She laughed softly. You'll always find a way to make things lighter. Only because life's heavy enough already, he said, looking into her eyes. His words lingered in her mind long after. Today's scene was a turning point in the film, an argument followed by forgiveness. It demanded real emotion, something deep and vulnerable. But the director didn't need to explain that. Keanu and Sandra already understood. They weren't just reading lines anymore. They were bringing parts of themselves into the story. The cameras rolled. Their characters stood face to face, surrounded by silence. The script called for Sandra's character to shout, to break the tension. But instead, she spoke softly. You could have stopped me. Why didn't you? Keanu looked at her, and his eyes softened in a way that didn't belong to fiction. Because I wanted you to find your own peace, he said. For a moment, she forgot the cameras. The pain, the relief, the memories, everything collided in one quiet second. Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, And if I never found it, he answered, then I would have waited until you did. The room went silent. No one moved. The director let the moment stretch. What they had captured was no longer acting, it was truth, expressed through emotion. When the scene finally ended, the director slowly said, Cut. But the crew stayed still. One of the assistants whispered, That didn't feel like a scene. That felt like two souls remembering each other. Sandra walked off set quietly, her heart still racing. She sat in the corner near the lights, trying to steady her breath. Keanu joined her a few minutes later, sitting beside her without saying a word. They stayed like that, silent but connected. Sometimes silence was the strongest language there was. After a while, he spoke softly. You okay? She nodded, her voice almost a whisper. I felt something I haven't felt in years. That means it's real, he said. Truth always finds its way out, even when we hide it. Sandra smiled faintly. How do you stay so calm through everything? Keanu looked down for a moment before answering, by remembering that every emotion is a guest. Anger, sadness, even joy. They come and go. I just try to welcome them with respect. His answer touched her deeply. It wasn't philosophy. It was wisdom learned through life. She realized that behind his calmness was someone who had been through storms, but had chosen peace instead of bitterness. The rest of the day passed slowly. Every scene they filmed carried quiet intensity. Between takes, the younger actors gathered near them, listening to their conversations, learning not just about acting but about grace. Keanu and Sandra never lectured anyone, yet everyone felt guided by their example. During lunch, a small incident happened that no one expected. One of the lighting rigs suddenly tilted, and a loud crash echoed across the set. Everyone flinched, but before the crew could react, Keanu stepped forward, steadying the equipment and ensuring no one was hurt. The room went still for a moment before applause broke out. Sandra's heart skipped. She ran closer and said, "You could have been hit." Keanu shrugged lightly, smiling. "It's just instinct. Safety first." She shook her head, half relieved and half upset. "You never think about yourself, do you?" He smiled softly. "Maybe I just trust that when you do the right thing, you're already safe." The crew watched them quietly, touched by the sincerity between them. What they saw wasn't a performance, it was care. After everything calmed down, the director announced an early wrap for the day. People started packing up, laughing, sharing stories about the near accident. Sandra stayed behind again, standing by the window where soft evening light spilled in. She could see the dust particles floating in the glow, and it reminded her how fleeting every moment really was. Keanu walked up beside her, still quiet, still calm. "You're thinking again," he said with a faint smile. "Always," she replied softly. "Today scared me." "Because of the accident?" he asked. "Because it reminded me how easily we forget to say what matters." She whispered. He nodded slowly, understanding without needing to ask. "Then say it," he said gently. She turned toward him, her eyes honest. "Thank you for being here, not just in this film, but in life." He looked at her quietly, his expression steady but kind. "You were never alone, Sandra, not even when you thought you were." Her eyes filled again, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were something softer, the kind that comes when the heart finally rests. They stood there, watching the sunset through the window, and for a moment it felt like the world outside had stopped moving. Their laughter, their silences, their kindness, all of it had become something that touched everyone around them. A young crew member passing by whispered to another, "They don't act kindness, they live it." And that night, when the studio went quiet, Sandra wrote one line in her notebook before sleeping. She wrote, "The strongest connection isn't spoken, it's felt in silence." And somewhere across town, Keanu sat by his window, looking at the moon, thinking about the same thing. Tomorrow, another scene would begin. But deep down, both knew something had already changed. The story was no longer just a film. It had become a mirror of their own hearts, learning to heal again. The next morning arrived, wrapped in a thin layer of mist, soft and silver. The film set was quiet again, but the silence carried a new warmth. People spoke in hushed voices, not out of pressure but out of respect. Everyone felt they were part of something rare, something that didn't happen often in movies anymore. Keanu walked in first. As always, dressed simply, holding a cup of tea instead of coffee. He greeted the camera crew, thanked the assistant who handed him the script, and moved with calm purpose. Even when he was alone, his presence made the place feel peaceful. Sandra arrived a few minutes later, carrying her own script and a faint smile. Her hair was tied back, her face calm but bright. There was something different in her eyes that morning, a quiet realization. She had stopped trying to act kindness. She was living it. Again, today's single quotes had scheduled included one of the most emotional scenes of the entire film, the moment when their characters shared memories of what once connected them. It was written as a nostalgic conversation, full of pauses and soft smiles, but no one knew how real those pauses would become. Before filming began, Sandra walked over to Keanu. "You ready for the heavy part?" she asked softly. He smiled gently. "If we tell the truth, it won't feel heavy, it'll feel right." The director gave them a small nod, signaling the start. The studio fell silent. The camera rolled. They sat opposite each other in the scene, the background filled with faint afternoon light. The dialogue began softly, like the start of a quiet confession. Sandra spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you remember that day we couldn't stop laughing? The director got so mad he stopped filming." Keanu smiled faintly. "I remember. We laughed for no reason. Maybe that's why it mattered." She nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "We were happy. Not perfect, just happy." He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Happiness isn't something you lose. It's something you stop noticing." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the camera. Sandra felt something inside her shift. His words weren't part of the script, but they reached straight to her heart. She replied quietly, "Then maybe I forgot how to notice." Keanu's expression softened even more. "Then let this moment remind you." A tear escaped her eye, and she didn't hide it. Keanu reached forward and wiped it gently with his thumb, not as an actor but as a friend who understood. The director didn't yell cut. No one dared to move. It felt sacred, like witnessing to souls, speaking truth under the disguise of fiction. When the scene ended, everyone stayed quiet for a few seconds. The director finally whispered, "That was it. We don't need another take." Sandra exhaled deeply, her heart full and steady. Keanu placed his hand gently on her shoulder and said, "You were real." She smiled faintly. "So were you." During the lunch break, the younger members of the crew gathered near them, asking questions about acting and emotion. One of them said, "How do you make it feel so real?" Keanu smiled softly. "By not trying to perform. Just listen. When you really listen, everything becomes truth," Sandra added. "And by respecting the moment, every emotion deserves respect, even the painful ones." The crew nodded, silently inspired. Many of them would carry that lesson far beyond this film. Later in the day, the weather turned windy, and clouds began to gather. The outdoor sequence planned for the evening had to be delayed. Most of the crew went inside to wait it out, but Sandra and Keanu stayed near the open set, watching the gray sky above. Raindrops began to fall slowly, tapping against the wooden railing. Sandra looked up and smiled. "I used to love rain scenes," she said. "They always felt honest." Keanu smiled back. "Maybe because the sky cries for you when you can't." She laughed softly. "You really say things that sound like poetry." "Only when the rain helps," he said, making her laugh again. They stood there, getting slightly wet, but neither moved. The sound of rain mixed with the distant hum of the studio generators. It was peaceful, almost cinematic. Then, without meaning to, Sandra said, "You know, I wish life had paused more often. Moments like this, quiet, simple, real." Keanu looked at her and replied, "Maybe it just did." She turned toward him, and for a second, they didn't say anything. The look in their eyes said more than any dialogue ever could. It wasn't love in the romantic sense, it was gratitude. Deep, unspoken gratitude for a bond that had survived time, distance, and silence. After the rain stopped, the crew resumed work. They filmed the evening scene by the water, the sky still heavy with clouds. In the story, their characters were meant to reflect on life's unpredictability. Keanu looked at her in the scene and said softly, "The hardest part of growing older is realizing that peace comes quietly." It wasn't in the script again, but no one cared. The line fit perfectly, and Sandra responded naturally. And laughter comes when you stop searching for it. The crew, once again, fell silent. The sound of their words, the calm rhythm, and the light reflecting on their faces made everyone feel like they were witnessing something pure. As the day ended, the director approached them, visibly emotional. "I've been filming for 20 years, he said quietly, "but I've never seen two people turn a story into truth like this. You don't act, you heal." Keanu nodded humbly. "Maybe we just remembered how to be human." Sandra smiled softly. "That's the best thing to remember." When everyone began leaving, Sandra stayed back once more. The set was quiet now, only the soft sound of water in the distance. She looked around at the space that had become more than a workplace. It had become a memory, one she would keep forever. Keanu joined her again, hands in his pockets, calm as always. "You're still thinking," he said. "I always do," she replied. "But this time, I'm thinking about good things." "Like what?" he asked gently. "Like how laughter never really leaves you," she said. "It just waits for the right person to bring it back." He smiled warmly. "Then I'm glad we both remembered how to laugh." She nodded. "Me too. It feels like healing." They walked together through the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps echoing softly. The studio lights flickered behind them, leaving their silhouettes framed in the warm glow from a distance. A young assistant whispered to another, "They make you believe that kindness still wins." And that was true, because that day, on that quiet set, two people proved that the world's greatest beauty wasn't in fame, or success, or perfection. It was in two hearts, choosing peace after years of silence. And as the door closed, behind them, the faint sound of their laughter drifted once more, calm, kind, eternal. The final day of filming came faster than anyone expected. The sun was warm that morning, spilling golden light across the studio floor. There was a quiet excitement mixed with sadness in the air, that bittersweet feeling that comes when something beautiful is about to end. Sandra arrived early, walking through the familiar hallway she had come to love over the past weeks. Every corner held a memory now. Laughter, silence, tears, peace. She stopped for a moment outside the main stage, took a deep breath, and smiled to herself. This film had given her more than a role. It had given her closure, healing, and friendship reborn. Inside, Keanu stood near the cameras, talking to one of the crew members. When he saw her, he smiled softly, that same calm smile that had become the center of her peace. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The last scene they were shooting was simple. No words, no long dialogue. Just the two of them sitting together, sharing quiet laughter as the camera slowly moved away. It was meant to show that life, no matter how complicated, always finds its way back to kindness. As the director called action. They sat side by side, their shoulders touching slightly. Sandra looked at Keanu and said softly, "You know, it feels like we're back where we started." He smiled gently. "Maybe we never really left." They both laughed softly at first, then louder, until the whole room seemed to glow with it. The crew stopped what they were doing just to watch. Every person in that room, from the lighting team to the assistants, could feel that something special was happening. It wasn't acting anymore. It was truth, captured on film. The laughter faded naturally, replaced by quiet smiles. Sandra turned to him and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me what kindness feels like." He replied softly, "You never lost it. You just needed to hear it again." The director's voice came through gently. "Cut." No one moved. The moment was too pure to break. Finally, quiet applause filled the room. The crew clapped not because the scene was perfect, but because it was real. As the lights dimmed and the cameras powered down, Keanu and Sandra stood together one last time in the middle of the set. There were no speeches, no big words, just a long, meaningful look and a shared smile that said everything. Sandra finally said, "This was more than a movie." Keanu nodded. "It always was." They walked toward the exit together, passing by the younger crew members who looked at them with admiration. One of them whispered, "They laughed like the old days." Another added softly, and everyone could feel it. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky gold. Sandra looked up, her eyes soft with peace. "You know," she said, "if someone asked me what this film was about, I'd say it's about people finding their hearts again." Keanu smiled gently. "Then we did it right." They both laughed quietly. One last time, the same laughter that had started it all, the same sound that made everyone stop and smile. It was the laughter of two souls who had lived, lost, remembered, and forgiven. As they walked away, hand in hand for just a moment, the set behind them fell silent. But in that silence, everyone could still hear it. That gentle, warm laughter that healed the air and reminded the world that kindness never grows old. And somewhere deep in their hearts, both knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning of peace, of friendship, and of something eternal that needed no name.